אז אני מאוד שמח לפתוח את הכנס השביעי שלנו, של התוכנית לכלכלה וחברה בבן-ליר. אנחנו מרגישים שלאור, כלומר מבחינת כמות הדיונים, היא לא מאוד גדולה, נקרא לזה כך, בנושא שהוא מאוד מאוד משמעותי ומתקבלות בו החלטות פעם בשנה. אני רואה לפחות שלוש, אפשר לקרוא להם אולי אי-סדירויות או בעיות בקבלת ההחלטות בשנים האחרונות. למשל, בשנה שעברה יש במדינת ישראל כלל הוצאה שמחליטים עליו מראש, ובשנה שעברה החליטו למעשה לרמוס את הכלל, כאילו הכלל לא היה קיים, ולהוציא הוצאה כאילו הכלל לא קיים, שזה כשלעצמו היה נכון, כי כפי שאנחנו אמרנו בכנס שלנו בשנה שעברה, הצרכים בצד ההוצאה היום במדינת ישראל הם מאוד משמעותיים, ולכן ההחלטה שהתקבלה כשלעצמה הייתה נכונה. אבל חלק ממה שאנחנו מנסים גם להעלות לדיון, זה כמו שגם ריצ'רד הזכיר את זה, נושא השקיפות. אז נשאלת השאלה, האם זאת הדרך הנכונה להתנהל? דוגמה נוספת היא שמתקבלות לא מעט החלטות כתגובה למחאות. זאת אומרת, יש מחאות, ואז כתגובה למחאות מתקבלות החלטות. הדוגמה מאוד מאוד מפורסמת של המחאה החברתית, שכולנו מכירים אותה, אבל אפשר להזכיר עוד שתי מחאות די משמעותיות, כמו בתחום החינוך, מה שנקרא מחאת הסרדינים, כלומר המחאה שהיא די מוכרת, ולאחרונה אנחנו רואים עוד איזושהי התעוררות בפריפריה, שזה כמובן קשור לכל מיני בעיות, שלא מעט מהם הם בתחום התקציב. והנקודה השלישית שאני רוצה להזכיר, היא בתחום הביטחון. בתחום הביטחון, למעשה מה שכל שנה אנחנו רואים מול עינינו כשמתרחש הדיון על התקציב, זה שיש דיון, באים כל השרים, מתרחש דיון, הדיון הוא מאוד משמעותי, כי כולם עסוקים להבין מה בסוף תהיה ההחלטה לגבי התקציב השנתי של כל משרד, חוץ ממשרד אחד, שהוא משרד הביטחון, כי משרד הביטחון הוא יודע שההחלטות שהתקבלו באותו דיון, באותו יום, הן לא בהכרח ההחלטות שיהיו רלוונטיות בסוף. זאת אומרת, בשלב יותר מתקדם, מתקבלות הרבה החלטות נוספות שקשורות בהעברת עודפים, דברים שמתנהלים במהלך השנה. הרבה פעמים זה מחויב המציאות. אם יש מבצע צבאי או משהו מסוג זה שלא ידעו עליו מראש, אז ברור שדבר כזה הוא מחויב המציאות. אבל אני לא מדבר רק על החלקים האלה, אלא למשל על השאלה מאוד גדולה, הוחלט לאחרונה שתקציב הביטחון יישאר ברמה מסוימת, האם באמת השחקנים, כולל השרים וכל מי שמשתתף בדיון הזה, מאמינים שזה יהיה המצב. אז השנה חשבנו שזה אחד הנושאים המשמעותיים והחלטנו להתמקד בו, ואם כבר החלטנו להתמקד בו, אין דרך טובה יותר מלהתחיל במתן תמונה על הנושאים האלה בעולם. מזלנו הוא שיש דובר שהוא מאוד מאוד מתאים לזה, ואני עוד מעט אציג אותו באנגלית. לפני שאני עושה את זה, התבקשתי להגיד מילה, יש אנשים שרואים את הכנס שלנו באמצעות האינטרנט, אז אנחנו השנה ערוכים, כשנגיע לחלק של השאלות, אנחנו ערוכים שחלק מהשאלות יהיו דרך הפייסבוק. אז אם אנשים שומעים בפייסבוק, אז אתם מוזמנים גם לשאול שאלות. יש פה מי שמנסה לקלוט את השאלות, ויכול להיות שנבחר אחת מהשאלות האלה כשנגיע לחלק של השאלות. חלק של שאלות יהיה אולי בסוף ההרצאה של האורח, ואחר כך יש את החלק שמציגים את התוכנית שלנו, תוכנית אלטרנטיבית מבחינת ההצעה קונקרטית לגבי איך צריך לראות התקציב, אז גם שם אפשר יהיה לשאול שאלות, וכמובן בסוף בפאנל. אז ברשותכם אני עובר לאנגלית, כדי להציג את הדובר שלנו. So it is a pleasure to have with us Professor Christos Kollias. Christos Kollias is Professor of Applied Economics at the University of Thessaly in Greece. He has previously held positions as an Associate Professor of Economics at the Department of Business Administration, Technological Education Institute of Larissa. He was also a professor at the Department of Economics at the University of Crete. He has published over 50 papers in journals and collected volumes on defense and peace economics. And in particular, I would like to mention that he's part of the editorial board of one of the most prestigious journals in this field, that is called Defense and Peace Economics. But he's also member of other editorial boards, like the European Review of Economics and Finance and Review of Economic Theory. I would like to mention mainly things that related to the topic today. So I want to mention that he has co-authored 2 books. One of them is Greece and Turkey, Defense, Economy, and National Strategy. So I think that he's the right person at the right place, and I am very pleased to introduce you and thank you to come here and share with us your knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have to say it is indeed a great honor for me to be here. Thank you for extending this invitation to me. It's been 20 years since my last visit to Israel, so my being here today brings to my mind nice memories from my last visit, and also it was a very educational visit as well, because yesterday I had the privilege of a private guided tour at the museum, and it was really a very educational experience, and I feel I have to thank publicly my hostess. The title of my presentation is Does Defense Expenditure Stimulate Growth? It has a big question mark. I suspect, and I have to warn you from the beginning, that at the end of my talk, I will not be able to fully answer to that question mark. That is why I have decided to add a subtitle, a bird's eye view. What I intend to do is to offer you, so to speak, a grand tour of the issues associated with the nexus between defense spending and the economy, the 2 pillars of national strategy for countries, because they both depend on one another. The defense sector, the production of security and military power, depends on the resources it draws from the economy. And a growing economy, a vibrant economy, is in a position to offer, to invest resources to the defense sector. But at the same time, we have to be aware of the possible negative impact and growth retarding effect this expenditure may have. Before I proceed, however, I have to apologize both to the audience and also the interpreter for my heavy Greek accent. I have tried over the years to improve it, but as you can see, or probably hear, I have not been very successful. As the saying goes, you cannot teach an old dog new tricks, so I hope it's not going to be very difficult in your ears. Let me start by briefly mentioning the structure of my presentation, of what I intend, the themes I intend to touch upon today. I will start with very briefly with some definitional issues of the terms that I will be using in order to ensure that, so to speak, we are on the same page. Then I will move on with a quantitative presentation of the defense sector on a global level. I will look at some snapshots of how big, how large in monetary terms is the defense sector globally. And also I would look at the trends that the major defense-related macroeconomic variables have exhibited through the years in order to identify, or to start identifying rather, the channels and the links between defense and the economy. Then, following that, I will move into the main theme of my presentation, which is the relationship between, the nexus between defense and the economy. I will start with a brief, or perhaps not so brief, theoretical discussion of the channels that connect those 2 sectors and the theoretical issues that arise when one tries to examine the possible effect that defense expenditure exerts on the economy. Then I will briefly stop at and discuss the accumulated empirical evidence of over 200 studies that have been published internationally and focus on this relation alone, how defense expenditure affects economic growth, let alone other economic aspects of the defense sector, such as budgetary aspects and the impact defense spending has on public deficits and public debt. And then using SIPRIS, and SIPRIS stands for the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. It is an institute that has been providing data on military expenditure globally for over 50 years, and most of us in the small community of defense economists rely on their provision of accurate and usable data. SIPRI has recently backdated its database to include the Cold War period, and this offers us the opportunity to empirically assess the relationship that I'm going to talk about for a much longer time period, and obviously this allows for more robust inferences that can be drawn. This database has not yet been publicly released. It is about to be released in September, so in a sense, SIPRI decided to share this database with people who work on this issue, select people of defense economists. So in a sense, this is the first time this database is used to look into the nexus between defense spending and the economy. Let me start with the definitional issues. Essentially, in defense economics and in the studies that examine the nexus between defense and the economy, we use two terms and two macroeconomic variables. Military expenditure in absolute terms, and as I will say in a minute, the defense burden, military expenditure expressed as a share of GDP. The first one, military expenditure in absolute terms, is an input measure. It is the monetary value of the resources we invest in the production of defense capabilities, of military strength. It is an input value, a variable that shows how much the labor and the capital that we use in the defense sector costs. It is not an output variable. It simply measures the costs of the resources. In Cicero terms, nervos belli pecuniam infinitum. The backbone of war, of the defense sector in a broader sense, is the money, the resources we invest into it. So it is not an output measure. However, having said that, it is possible under some very, very brave assumptions to use this variable as an indirect and very distant proxy of military strength. In the sense, the more you pay for the production of military strength, the more military strength you produce. But the brave assumption we make, if we use it as such as a proxy, is that countries use those resources in the same efficient way. To give you a simple example, country A and B, their military expenditure is $10. Country A uses the $10 much more efficiently, so obviously the outcome, it's, in terms of military strength, it's higher defense capabilities for country A. The second variable we use is the defense burden, military expenditure expressed as a share of GDP. And it is this burden that I will be using in the empirical examination that I will conduct later on in my presentation when I try to investigate the nexus between defense spending and economic growth. It's military expenditure expressed as a share of GDP. It shows how much of our income we devote, we invest to national defense and national security. And therefore, assuming that states behave rationally, it could be an indirect proxy of the security challenges, the defense challenges country faces. For example, let's take the cases of Israel and Greece. Both, compared to other countries, have over the years allocated a much higher percentage to defense than countries such as Ireland or Belgium. Greece and Israel of course more than Greece, clearly are two examples of countries that face acute external security challenges, threats, and therefore they are forced to invest more scarce resources to their defense. How efficiently they do that, it's a totally different question, because clearly the efficiency question is very important. And a last example of how the security environment can affect defense expenditure is how the United States military expenditure evolved during the Second World War. You can see before the Second World War, defense spending was around 2% of GDP, and as the United States got involved in the Second World War, during the climax of the summit of the Second World War, you can see that defense spending almost reached 50%, 40% of the GDP at the time. So clearly this is an indicator of how intense the threat and the security challenges are for specific countries. So those are the two variables that I will use. Let me start by quantifying the defense sector globally using CIPRI's data. In 2015, total global military expenditure amounted to $1.7 trillion, around 2.3% of global GDP. In terms of the human resources, in terms of the labor that we invest in the defense sector globally, the armed forces amounted to about 27 million people, roughly 0.8% of the total labor force globally. So it is a fairly big sector. It uses up 2.3% of GDP, and if we go in the past, even more than that. But this $1.7 trillion that globally was spent on defense is not equally distributed between the countries in the world. A very large percentage of it, 36% in 2015, was the defense budget of the United States. In fact, the first 15 biggest spenders in the world account for over 80% of total global military spending. If now we could, if we try to use defense expenditure as a proxy of military power, I think this pie more or less tells a story. By far, the United States are the strongest country in the world, militarily. Of course, this does not necessarily justify the need to spend such a large portion of their national income to defense. But this is the distribution we had in 2015 in terms of defense expenditure globally. You have the biggest spenders accounting for almost 80% globally, and Israel is the smallest portion of this group of countries. I'm sure I'm stirring up some attention there, but this is not my figures, it's CIPRI figures. You can dispute them, but that's what is being used globally and internationally. What is also interesting to observe is how this variable has evolved through time. If we take the defense spending variable and look at it, how it the trend it has exhibited through time, we can identify on it major strategic changes and development in the global security environment. And by the way, this is in real terms, is in constant prices. It has been deflated. We can very easily identify, for example, at the beginning of the period, the effect the Korean War had. And we can also see that throughout the Cold War period, despite the inevitable fluctuations from one year to another, the trend has been constantly upward. And we can also identify the impact of the collapse of bipolarity, the end of the Cold War. And there, during this first post-Cold War period, many countries have sharply reduced their defense budgets. But this downward trend that we can identify during the first post-bipolar decade sharply reversed after 2000. Mainly because of the effects of the 9/11 terrorist events in the United States and the ensuing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also because two emerging major players in the international environment, China and Russia, have since the early 2000s increased by very rapidly their defense budgets. They are arming or rearming, since one can say that they are aspiring to play a global role again. And we can also identify the effects exerted by the recent economic crisis and the fiscal constraints it imposed for many countries, such as the United States, France, Germany, Britain, the biggest spenders internationally, and that's why we see this slight decrease in defense spending internationally, although the latest figures seem to suggest that, again, it's reverting to an upward trend. A similar picture with Israel defense expenditure. We can identify major events: the Sinai War, the Six-Day War, the effect of the Yom Kippur War, the start of the first Intifada and the pressure it exerted on the Israeli defense budget, the start of the second Intifada, and so on. And I'm hoping I'm getting the dates correctly there, but I have looked up at, I have done my homework, and I'm sure I'm not making a mistake. You can see that, and this can be applied for almost every country. In the defense budget of every country, we are almost able to identify the specific events that have exerted an influence on how it has evolved through time. I will come back to the Israeli defense when I talk about the defense burden in Israel. So in fact, what I just did is I have looked at the factors that influence defense expenditure. They can be grouped into two categories: internal and external. The external refer to the strategic environment, the threats, the security challenges that can affect defense expenditure by a country, but also the defense spending of allies. And the plus or minus sign that I have there indicates how in empirical studies these variables have affected defense expenditure. And then we have the internal factors, mostly the economy, from where the resources are drawn. A growing economy allows the allocation of more resources to defense expenditure if this is what it is necessary, or even the political or ideological color of the government. In theory, we would expect, although this is not supported by empirical findings, I have to stress that a more conservative government would allocate more resources to defense, will be more pro-defense, and a more left-wing government would allocate less resources to defense. Again, I have to stress that this is the theoretical expectation. In practice, this is not what we have found. And since in the beginning we mentioned costs, one important driver of the increasing defense budgets in many countries are the costs of defense equipment. Throughout history, the cost of defense equipment have been increasing at a rate faster than the average inflation. That's why in defense economics we use the term defense inflation, in order to capture this faster increase of the cost of defense equipment, something that Augustine was an Undersecretary of State in the United States in the 70s or 80s, if my memory doesn't fail me, expressed what he called the final law of economic disarmament, where he predicted that in the year 2054, the entire United States defense budget will be able to purchase just one fighter aircraft, which had to be shared between the Navy and the Air Force for 3.5 days a week, and during leap years, for the extra day, the Marines could have the use of that airport. And this was in order how he tried to stress the continuously rising cost of defense and the effect that this can have on the defense budgets. And as I said before, the increasing defense expenditure over the last decade, 15 years or so, has mostly been driven by the increases in countries such as China and Russia and also Saudi Arabia, that between 2000 and 2015, they have more than 3 times, almost 4 times increased their defense budget. And you can see the impact of the recent economic crisis on the defense budget of the United States, the UK, France, that have because of the fiscal constraints that they faced, they had to reduce their defense budgets. That is as far as this variable, military expenditure in absolute terms, is concerned. Now, the other variable, the one that I will also use in my empirical investigation, and that has, it is used by most researchers when they try to find out how the defense sector affects the economy, is the defense burden, defense expenditure as a share of GDP. And here you can see a slightly different picture. Over the post-war period, the defense burden during the Cold War period has exhibited a slightly upward trend, but definitely a clear downward trend during the post-bipolar period. Countries, as a share of GDP, they are allocating less resources to defense. In fact, convergence analysis suggests that there is a slow process of convergence globally, and countries seem to be converging towards similar levels of defense expenditure as a share of GDP. And there I simply, this outlier is the so-called Kuwait effect, the result of the impact the Kuwait defense budget had on the global average. You can see it exceeded their GDP because they took out a very big loan at the time of the Iraqi invasion. But in any case, the important structural difference that we have to bear in mind is that on average, the defense burden during the Cold War period was appreciably higher than what it is during the post-bipolar period. And in fact, there is a slow process of convergence. And if we take 5-year average, you can see that more and more countries tend to converge towards a defense burden at or below the 5% average of GDP. You can see we have a greater dispersion as we go back into time, and we have a greater concentration of countries as we move towards 2015. This is a graphical representation of this convergence process that seems to be taking place globally. And a similar exercise with the Israeli defense budget as a share of GDP. Again, you can see that Israel seems to be following the similar pattern in terms of the defense burden. The Israeli defense burden has been declining over the years. Currently, it's around 6%, below 6% of GDP. But in comparative terms, is still appreciably higher to groups of countries such as the European Union, 28, not 27 yet, not yet. So this is the EU 28 average, and or the OECD. You can see that the Israeli defense burden is appreciably higher compared to those groups of countries. Again, this is an issue that perhaps we can discuss later on, but clearly there is an issue of an opportunity cost there, of the cost of defense in terms of the resources that are allocated to the production of military power. So, enough with the quantitative presentation of the defense sector globally. Let me move into the theoretical discussion of how defense spending affects the economy. We can group the impact, the effects of defense spending on the economy into 4 major categories. The first one is the one that I have already mentioned, the so-called opportunity cost of defense, encapsulated by the guns versus butter dilemma. We have the resources, should we use it to produce guns, to buy guns, or should we use it to buy butter, in inverted commas, and I will come back to it. The other 2 categories are the so-called demand side and supply side effects, and I will explain in a minute what they indicate, they suggest, when it comes to defense spending and the economy. And finally, a category that it is often neglected, the so-called security benefits. And let me say a few words, starting from the last channel, this last channel. When we use the term security benefits, we are trying to identify the positive impact that defense expenditure and the defense sector can have on the economy by providing a secure environment in which economic activity and investment activity takes place. We can very easily think of a country that it is insecure, that it faces many threats, if it cannot protect itself, this clearly can have a detrimental effect on economic activity. So there are intangible and not easy to quantify security benefits that stem from the defense sector to the economy, in the sense that it provides this secure and safe environment in which economic activity, investment activity can flourish. And I will introduce this later on when I try to summarize the effects. Starting from the opportunity cost of defense, the guns versus budget dilemma, clearly it's a classic example of how we use our budgetary resources. Do we use them, do we spend them on defense, and how much do we spend on defense, or do we use them in terms of other forms of public expenditure, such as social, educational, health, or infrastructure expenditure? Clearly, there is a budgetary trade-off between the budget of the defense ministry and the budgets of other ministries. And here one has to also introduce, apart from the opportunity cost, the possible beneficial effects in terms, for example, of human capital formation that other types of budgetary items can generate. Investing in human capital clearly has many beneficial economic effects. So it is not only in terms of a crowding out effect, but also how the expenditure, the public outlays that have been crowded out by defense spending could affect the economy. And there you can see some similar comparisons in the case of Israel, again with the EU and the OECD, and you can see the differences in terms of health expenditure as a percentage of total government expenditure, and here I have public health expenditure, not private health expenditure, or as a share of GDP compared to military expenditure as a percentage of the total government expenditure, or as a percentage of GDP, and you can see clearly the differences when you compare Israel with the European Union or the OECD averages for the period of 20 years that I have the data there. The other group of effects, those are the more technically difficult to identify, are the demand and supply effects. I'm using the typical aggregate demand identity there to identify the channels through which the defense sector can affect economic activity. I will not go into the technical details. I will simply name the possible impact that defense spending can exert on the economy. And here I have only the possible, theoretically possible, positive effects on the economy. First of all, defense expenditure, it's a public expenditure. Just as in the case of any other public expenditure, it could potentially have aggregate demand stimulation effect. It can lead to increased employment of underemployed or idle labor and capital. It can lead to capacity utilization, and through the multiplier, it can help prop up growth. So clearly, exactly the same argument that we would use for any other type of public expenditure can be applied here, allowing for the opportunity cost of defense and for the fact that other budgetary items are clearly socially more preferable compared to defense. For example, the domestic production of defense equipment, the defense industry, is a major channel through which the defense sector, defense expenditure, can positively affect economic growth. You spend money into the production of military equipment domestically, this creates jobs, it leads to technological improvements. Technological improvements can spill over to the rest of the economy, and under plausible assumptions, we can argue that this leads to productivity growth and, of course, to a growth stimulating effect. Also, employment in the armed forces, people who serve in the armed forces, they are trained, they acquire skills, etc., which later can be used in their civilian lives. In fact, and that's why I mentioned Emile Benoit there, who was the first to try to empirically examine the impact of military expenditure in the case of 60 underdeveloped countries back in the 1970s. he found a positive impact. And although he a priori expected to find a negative effect, the positive correlation that he identified, but remember this it was an empirical investigation using data back from the 50s and 60s, he thought that it could be explained in terms of the skills that people acquire in the armed forces, and also in terms of the infrastructure that are necessary for the defense sector, airports, ports, telecommunication networks, roads, that clearly are important in the defense planning of a country, but also have civilian beneficial effects. They can be used by the civilian economy and therefore help prop up growth. The other channel of positive effects from the defense sector to the economy is through the technological spillovers, again via the defense industry. As you can see, a major channel through which the positive effects can be identified is the domestic production of the equipment that are used in the defense sector. However, this is not applicable for all countries. If we look at globally, the defense industry is concentrated in the developed industrialized countries. For example, out of the 100 largest defense industries globally in 2014, 59 of them were based in the United States and in Europe. 14 in Russia, 3 in Israel, 6 in South Korea, 5 in Japan, and 2 in Australia. So, if there are beneficial effects, and this is a big if, from defense expenditure to the economy via the defense industry channel, this will probably be more evident in the developed countries, the countries that have the industrial capacity to produce the inputs required by the defense sector, and not in countries that they do not have such an industrial capacity. So this positive channel is probably present mostly in the developed industrialized countries rather than in the less developed countries. And that is why the major exporters of military equipment in the world are developed countries. If we look at the international arms trades, 30% of it is exports from the United States, around 26 to 27% exports from the European Union countries, again, big industrialized countries, 25% from Russia, because they are able to sell at lower and more competitive prices equipment that it is not just as technologically advanced, and the rest, 20%, is from all other exporters. So the defense production globally is dominated by the industrial countries, and therefore they would be the ones that would reap, that they will yield any benefits in terms of the defense industry channel. If we, just to keep the balance, if we look at the other side of the international arms trade, you can see how this spreads over a much greater number of countries. We do not have any major importers there, but you can also notice that there are major arms producers such as the United States that they also import arms. Obviously, it is cheaper for them to import some equipment rather than to produce it at home. However, apart from the positive effect that I have just mentioned, there is a cohort of possible, or theoretically possible, negative effects running from defense expenditure to the economy. First of all, as I have already mentioned, it can crowd out other public expenditure which potentially is more productive, which potentially exerts a greater positive effect on impact, such as, for example, infrastructure expenditure, public expenditure. But the most important channel that has been identified by many empirical studies being as the source of the negative effect of military expenditure on growth is through the crowding out of private investment. In fact, the first study back in 1980 by Ron Smith that addressed this question found a coefficient almost 1-to-1, in the sense that 1% increase in defense spending would lead to 1% reduction in investment expenditure. And since investment is considered to be the steam engine of growth, This is the major, the most important channel through which defense spending reduces or slows down economic growth. Essentially, they both compete for financing from the same sources, so increasing defense spending would reduce the resources, the monetary resources available for investment. Also, defense spending can generate fiscal problems in terms of public deficits and debt. And since most countries in the world are net importers of arms equipment, clearly importing arms equipment has an impact on the balance of payment or on the currency reserves and so on. And finally, to look at the other side of the technological channel of positive effects that I mentioned before, there is a lot of evidence that suggests and argues that we do not have a process of spillovers from technological spillovers from the defense industry to the civilian sector, but rather in more recent years we have a process of spill-ins, i.e. the defense industry using, and that's what COTS means, civilian off-the-shelf technology and applying it to solve defense problems. So it is not necessarily that we only have a spillover process, but it is possible that there is a spill-in process, and therefore this weakens the argument of a technological positive effect from defense spending via the domestic production channel to the rest of the economy, to the civilian of the economy, sector of the economy. So we must keep this in mind. Although I tried to summarize the negative and positive effects, I thought I would try to be a little bit more technical in representing them and introducing the idea of the security benefits I mentioned earlier. I will start my brief explanation of this diagram from the upper right-hand side of the diagram. Let us assume in an economy that we decide to reduce the resources allocated to the civilian sector of the economy and allocate more resources to the military sector because we have more acute external security problems. I assume that investment, and I move this way, I assume that investment is a function of what is happening in the civilian economy. Since we allocate less resources in the civilian economy, this will also have a negative effect on investment. If investment will be reduced. A reduction in investment, we know that will slow down growth rates. So this reduction in the investment will lead to a reduction in the growth rates of the economy. So that would be the negative effect of defense spending. Assuming that there are no other positive effects, the only other positive effect that could potentially counteract partially or even totally this negative impact on the growth rates would be through the extra security we buy, the security benefit that creates a more secure and safe environment for the economy to flourish. Clearly, this can partially offset this reduction in the growth rates or totally. Again, it depends on what assumptions you make about the elasticity. So this would be the diagram that would summarize both the negative and positive effects of defense spending in the economy. However, if you think that we are out of the woods, we are not. Because all these channels, positive or negative, that defense spending can affect the economy, we had to put them under the test of a number of different questions. For example, and some of them I have already mentioned, are these effects, positive or negative, similar across all countries? Do they apply for both developed and developing countries, high income or low income countries, arms producers or arms importing countries, because we have developed countries that are importing much of their equipment. So, do we expect the impact of defense spending to be uniform across all countries? And most importantly, do we expect it to be uniform both in countries with acute external security problems and in countries that do not face security challenges? I have in mind here a fairly recently published paper in the Journal of International Trade and Development, if I'm not mistaken, that examines this question: how the impact of defense expenditure may differ between a country that has no security problems and between a country that has security problems. And their results seem to suggest that countries with security problems, with external security threats, they seem to enjoy more positive impact from defense spending, exactly because it creates this safe and secure environment in which investment and economic activity can flourish. So the first question we have to bear in mind is whether the impact is uniform across all countries, irrespective of their characteristics. The second question is, does the impact remain the same throughout time? Is it always the same effect, or does it change? For example, is the impact the same during periods of recessions? And is it the same during periods of fast economic growth? Clearly not. One would expect that the aggregate demand argument that I have just made probably is stronger during period of recessions. In fact, John Maynard Keynes, in the general theory, mentioned somewhere, photographing Germany, that one European country, by the process of rearming just before the Second World War, managed to help the economy move out of the recession. So it is possible that the effects that we are talking about are not constant through time, that they differ depending on the business cycle, or even depending on the fiscal situation a country is faced with. For example, currently, obviously, defense expenditure in Greece, it's much more of a burden, given that Greece is a effectively bankrupt country, than it was perhaps 10 or 20 years ago. Also, we have to bear in mind that defense spending, it's not uniform. It compromises many different types of expenditure that we could intuitively expect to have a different economic effect. It includes expenditure on equipment, and if this is domestically produced, we have the aggregate demand argument. It includes personnel expenditure, so this affects household consumption expenditure. It includes expenditure on operation and maintenance, and it includes expenditure on infrastructure. Clearly, these different types of expenditure that form total defense spending can have a different economic impact on the economy. And finally, what I consider to be, may I say, the mother of all questions is, do we expect the effects to be the same at all levels of military expenditure? Do we expect them to be the same when a country spends a lot of resources to defense and when it spends a few resources to defense? Or do they differ? Is there, in other words, an optimum level, in inverted commas, of defense expenditure that can ensure zero or very few negative effects, allowing for the opportunity cost of defense, and perhaps yield the most positive effects from defense spending on the economy? And this is an issue that is currently being debated among defense economists. Hoping to have done a good job in summarizing the positive and negative effects of the economy, let me throw to you a few more questions regarding the best way in which we can go about examining, empirically investigating these effects. How do we do that? Do we go for single country studies? Do we take a specific country and examine the impact of defense expenditure in that country? Or do we proceed with multi-country studies, which of course raises a number of technical econometric questions of how we do that? And what models do we use? The problem is that we do not have a universally accepted theoretical framework through which we can come and assess the economic impact of defense expenditure. And because of this lack of this theoretical consensus regarding the channels through which we should be looking to identify the effects of defense expenditure, the results that have been yielded by almost 200 studies so far are mixed. Some of them point to a net positive effect, others point to a net negative effect. In a sense, the jury is still out. No decision has been made. However, on balance, if I try to summarize that, I would tentatively argue that the scales seem to be tilting in favor of mostly either negligible no effect or a mostly negative effect concentrated in the developing countries. And again, this is a tentative summarization of the 200 or more studies that have been published so far. I'm aware that a number of colleagues may disagree with me, but it seems that the evidence is tilting in favor of either no positive effect or mildly positive, but mostly negative in developing countries, which suggests that, in fact, the impact of defense expenditure on growth, it is not uniform across all countries. Now, what I intend to do before I finish my presentation, and I don't want to overextend my welcome at the podium, is to use the new consistent CIPRI data set to examine this question empirically for a number of countries. Now, the new data set, as I said, extends back to 1950. The further back you go in time, the fewer number of countries are there, have data available. So, in choosing the sample of countries that me and a good colleague of mine that I have been working together for almost 20 years now, Susanna Palologou, have done is we have tried to find a delicate compromise, a delicate balance between TNNs, in other words, between how back in time we can extend our empirical investigation and how many countries we can include in the sample. The further back we go, the fewer countries in the sample. The closer we come to nowadays, the more countries in the sample. So the balance we found was 44 years from 1971 to 2014, and our sample includes a total of 2,700 observations. I will explain in a minute what that means. We have 65 countries, so we investigate this relationship for the whole sample, and then we decided to break it up into 3 sub-samples. A high-income country, a high-income group of countries with 30 countries, a middle-income one, and a low-income one with 19 countries. This division, it was not our decision, it was based on how the World Bank classifies the countries, and that's how we have included them in the 3 different sub-samples. In our investigation and in the results that I'm going to present here, we focus on 2 key macroeconomic variables. We examine how defense spending affects growth rates and how it affects private investment. We do that because most of, if not all of the studies, those are the variables that they concentrate. The growth rate to capture the demand stimulating effects of defense expenditure that I mentioned earlier, and investment expressed as a percentage of GDP to capture the possible crowding out effect of private investment and the negative impact this exerts on growth performance. So as a brief reminder, the growth enhancing effects refer to the effective demand stimulation, the growth retarding effects refer to the crowding out of private investment. That's why we have introduced those 2 macroeconomic variables in our empirical investigation. And after all, those are the 2 of the key macroeconomic variables that describe how an economy is performing. Those are the descriptive statistics of our sample, the averages, and as you can see, all groups, both the high-income group and the average, and the middle and the low-income group, have a fairly healthy growth rate exhibit a fairly healthy growth rate during the period. Similar performance in terms of investment as a share of GDP, and you can see the slight differences in terms of the average defense budget. Those are the descriptive statistics just to show you a picture of what is happening there. So it is interesting to observe that the highest defense burden, 3.1%, is exhibited by the high-income countries and not the middle or the low-income countries that, by the way, they are the most conflict-afflicted countries in the world. So this is an interesting observation. It's something that we could possibly discuss later on, but this is the descriptive statistic. Now, how do we do that? And I will not go into the technicalities. We use a panel var. A panel var is, you have time series and cross-sectional data. We simply try to identify the statistical association between the three variables. The most exogenous variable in our panel var is the growth rate, and the most endogenous one is military expenditure expressed as a percentage of GDP, and investment acting like a sort of a buffer variable that allows for the possible negative effects from military expenditure to the growth rate. So what we are trying to identify is a significant statistical association between the three variables. We have done all the due diligence in terms of testing the variables using various econometric tests. I will not bother you with the technicalities. I will simply go straight to the paper is currently under consideration for publication. I will go straight into the descriptive results, the description of the results that we have found, and we tend to believe that they seem to be painting a fairly interesting picture. First of all, let me start. I will concentrate on the first four volumes. I will ignore this one. This is not directly related to what we are discussing today. First of all, let me look at the entire sample. For the entire sample, the only statistically significant positive association that we have established for this sample of countries and for this time period is between GDP and military expenditure. Not from military expenditure to GDP, but rather from GDP to military expenditure. This is, in our group of defense economists, this is a clear indication that the positive sign suggests that as the economy grows, more resources are made available to defense. So more resources are allocated, are invested, if you want, to defense users. And it is interesting to observe that this positive association relationship, causal ordering, if you wish, from growth to military spending is identified only for the entire sample and only for the middle and low incomes and low income countries. And that's where conflict comes into it. Those are the countries that are most conflict afflicted, so this suggests that as their economies grow, they allocate more resources to national security. This association is not present in the high income countries. In the high income countries, however, the reverse causal ordering, so to speak, and I'm using the terms fairly loosely here, is present. We have a positive association, a positive relationship running from military expenditure to growth rates. And this we at least tentatively interpreted as capturing the aggregate stimulating effects of military expenditure, mostly via the domestic arms production channel. Those are the countries that in comparative terms have a stronger industrial base that can produce defense inputs. So we interpret it in terms of the defense industry, and this interpretation is reinforced also by the fact that we also identify a positive association from military expenditure to investment. So it is possible that through the defense budget and through the defense industry, also private investment is positively affected by such expenditure and or the presence of dual-use technology and infrastructure. But we have also found a clear negative sign, and this comes to rend support to what I have been arguing before, from investment to military expenditure in the low-income group of countries. This is a clear indication of a trade-off between investment and military expenditure, and if we bear in mind that the low-income countries are the ones that they face the more acute resource constraints in terms of investment, this probably explains the negative income. I know I'm probably running out of time, so a very brief summary of the results. There seems to be evidence, again, I'm not arguing that this cannot be challenged, that there is a positive association only in the high-income countries. There is no such association in the middle and low-income countries, and this positive association we tend to to explain it in terms of the effective demand channel and in terms of the domestic production of defense equipment. But as I said, this data set has only recently been made available. Clearly, over the next years, we will see many more studies examining in a more sophisticated manner than we do that here, because the panel VAR we use, strictly speaking, is a theoretical way to approach an economic relationship. So it is possible that those results will be overturned by future findings in the near future. So I hope I have not overstayed my welcome. Thank you for your patience, and if you have any questions.
So maybe we can take one or two questions if someone wants to ask.
Did I exploit all my time allocated?
Yeah.
Oh my God, sorry.
No, it's okay.
I was trying to be with
maybe if someone, Professor Kollias also will be at the panel, so he will explain some further things afterwards in the panel, but maybe there are one or two questions that...
One question. What's mean like...
Yes.
So the relation between the... Yeah, it's okay. The relation between the GDP and the MILEX, what does it actually mean? How big is the influence?
I cannot put a value to it.
Roughly.
I cannot quantify it.
So maybe it's negligible.
That's why I said in most cases it seems to be very, very low, very, very small. Yeah, very small.
By the way, what's MILEX? What's
military expenditure? This is the
jargon. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry,
Thank you.
Have explained
Thank you.
Let's take another question.
The only quantifiable relationship that has so far we can talk about is this crowding out between military expenditure and investment, which is almost a one-to-one. But in terms of growth, different studies have found different effects, so I cannot come up with an average, so to speak.
In your...
I did something here. There it is.
Were you able to break out research and development and military spending? And if not in the larger data set, could you just say a couple sentences on what you found in your other work?
Yes. Unfortunately, one of the problems that we face with the data, one of the data limitations that we have, is that we do not have a consistent breakdown of military expenditure. We have only the aggregate. There are a couple of projects going on to break it up in different categories. NATO, for example, for NATO members, do publish data per category. However, most of us believe that they are not consistent, they are not comparable. What Greece reports, for example, as, let's say, equipment expenditure or infrastructure expenditure may not be exactly the same with what, let's say, Belgium or France reports. So there is a problem of consistency and comparability of the data, and that's why it has not been used apart from one or two studies that I know of.
No, I meant military spending on total R&D.
That's even worse there. Unfortunately, the only data we have, and this is very sketchy, is from the United States. And I don't remember any specific empirical study, but I stand to be corrected here, examining the military R&D effect in a long time series and the effect it has on the United States, yes. But I stand to be corrected there. I cannot recall all the studies I have read over there.
Okay, so thank you very much.
I hope I